Hello.
Hisham Matar.
Hi. Hello. Alex Clark.
Hisham, I've known you for so long, although I haven't seen you for a long time. And just before you were having your photograph taken, and I said, you haven't aged at all.
It's not true.
But I know, well, you know, we've all aged a little, but I felt I would just get on your good side before I started.
You've done it already. No,
before I started to grill you mercilessly about your amazing book,
yeah.
My Friends. I have loved your work since the very beginning. This novel is an extraordinary novel. I think it has taken you, well, I said to you yesterday when we were chatting, it feels like the kind of novel that takes you many years to write. And you said, well, all my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a book that I've been thinking about for a long time, you know. And I thought I've been thinking about it since 2012, when I had this idea for a novel about friendship, and particularly about three male friends, and particularly three Libyan male friends exiled in London. And I thought that would be a good way to write about something that is very difficult to talk about, which is questions of temperament. You know, and I felt the novel is really a place for temperament. And so to have these three very intimate men who are temperamentally different, who agree on a lot of things, but their temperaments are different. So I had that idea, and I wrote the first couple of pages, and then I just didn't know what happens next. And it's really the opening of the book. And
that survived,
yeah,
that initial...
I carried it in my head. I mean, I know I will be reading to you from it, but just to give you an impression of how it was sort of hosted in my mind, you know. I would be walking around with those lines. You know, it is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own, or those we know well, especially those we know best. But as I'm monitoring my old friend Hisham Matar, so on, I would just have this in my mind.
You do your whole reading by heart, do you?
and it was, you know, and I really genuinely didn't know what happens next. There were clues in it, you know. Yes. So that's what I initially thought. I had started thinking about it in 2012, but then a few years ago, the British Museum asked my wife and I to do a little exhibit. My wife is a visual artist, and the British Museum holds some of her work, and they wanted her to do a display about that work called Evidence, and then asked me to do a display about my book, The Return, and use objects for the British Museum and objects from our own archive, if you want to put it that way. And I was looking for things that I was in my box of scribbles around the time I was writing The Return, and I found a note from much earlier, from 2003, when we were living in Paris, where on the back of an envelope I'd written an idea for a novel, just 3 lines, and it's basically this book, you know. It's an idea about you know, 3 friends who start in the same place and end up in different places. That was sort of the way I'd written it on the back of the envelope. So it's certainly a book that
it's really gestated.
It's been
and then to have written The Return, your work of non-fiction that is, well, nearly 10 years ago, certainly since you started.
Yes, 2016
it came out.
Yeah.
That's an entirely different kind of writing.
Yeah.
Or maybe it doesn't feel like that to you.
It doesn't
maybe
really.
The gap between fiction and non-fiction doesn't feel so definite.
Yeah, it doesn't. And also I feel that, I mean, in some ways it is definite. I feel I am much more, naturally, much more of a novelist. I mean, I think that way. And writing nonfiction, I wrote nonfiction in the way that I would imagine a novel would be constructed, you know. But the other thing that is harder to account for when you ask a question like that, one of the things I think about is how to account for this strange thing that happens where you feel that every book you've written has rewired your imagination in some way. That the books that you write, in other words, are your fate, not only in the sense that you can't choose them, or at least I don't feel I'm sitting and choosing, oh yeah, which book I'm going to write. I mean, I have a choice. The choice is not to write it. But I don't feel that I have a choice in the kind of book that I write. I don't really think that's a choice. So they're your fate in that sense, but they are also your fate in the sense that in the time it takes to write a book like that, it takes me a good number of years to write a book like that, the book is also working on you. You're also being written by it in some way.
Well, Hisham does, and we will talk about Friends, we really will.
Yeah.
But I'm now going to follow you down this rabbit hole because it's so interesting. If the book is in some sense, and you may be talking in a way at a kind of metaphorical level, you may not, your fate, can you change your fate in the writing of it? I mean, you are manipulating that. You may not have a choice about whether to write it, other than to not write it. Yeah. But there are choices all the way through in writing novels, aren't there? I mean, that's one of the things. I'm sure that's true. But the way it's experienced, at least in my sense, is that I'm involved in a practice, and this practice leads me down certain ideas, certain themes, certain sounds, certain language, structure, rhythm, all of these things that I am working with day to day, and they cultivate me, you know? They ask of me certain things that I'm not sure in an abstractly sort of blank day I would seek those things. So down to what I'm reading, what I'm listening to, the music I gravitate towards, the people I gravitate towards. I don't want to make it too dramatic. It's not, you know, totally like that. But in some way, the companionship of the book that you're writing is an emotional and intellectual companionship that, like all of the other relationships we have in our life, they educate us, you know. Thinking about the book as it starts, and we'll hear a little bit from the beginning of it in a minute. It's about three friends, and quite rightly you say that temperament is a key thing that marks them as different from one another, and their temperaments, also in that triangular friendship, work differently between each of them. Yeah. But there's also time. Time is a huge part of this novel, and you work across sort of two time structures, don't you? There is a very small period of time in which our narrator is walking through London, recalling things. Yeah. And there are all the things that he's recalling. Yeah. And the ebb and flow of friendship, what happens within relationships, changes so profoundly over the course of those times, at just the same time as vast, as it were, public, historical, national events are happening. Such a complicated and interesting structure.
Well, I think time, I mean, for all writers, time is really the secret protagonist, you know. It's really, and we also know from our experience of time that not all time is the same. And it's not necessarily always linear. Sometimes it's circular. Sometimes it's, there are stratas of time. There are certain moments in our life that feel incredibly deep, where time stretches in a different way. And there are days and days and days, or if you're like me, there are months and months and months where they just shrink. You don't actually have much of a recollection of them. So all of that has always fascinated me as a reader and as a writer. I've always gravitated towards that. I found that so interesting. It's one of the reasons for why music has been so important for me, because music thinks about time in ways that sometimes seem much more explicit, you know? You could sort of, and so one of the things that I wanted to create is I wanted to create a moment, one of those moments where everything opens up, and you know, those moments in time that we have all gone through them, a certain quality of light, a certain hour that opens up in your day, and you're just ready enough that you feel something happens. There's a much more expansive capability in it. And a lot of things get absorbed in that, or can do. So I wanted a novel that's situated in one of those moments. Unhurried, vast, but very specific. It's a walk. He's walking from St. Pancras to Shepherd's Bush. Takes about 2.5 hours. And, but the whole book is narrated across that walk. And years, of course, decades are expressed. So time in that sense, but also stratas of temperament, different kinds of moments he's able to conjure up. And then whilst all of that is happening, he's, of course, making his way through London and the city that he knows very well. So I became very curious. That first page I mentioned to you, it is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own, or those we know well, perhaps especially those we know best. But as I stand here on the upper level of King's Cross Station, from where I can monitor my old friend, Hisham Matar, walking across the concourse, I feel I can see right into him, perceive him more accurately than ever before, as though all along, during the 2 decades that we have known one another, our friendship has been a study. And now, ironically, his portrait is coming into view. No? That sentence had in it all sorts of clues for me that this is a book about time, about that infinite, complicated distance between what is in our chests and what is expressed, which I feel is the gap where literature resides, really. Yes. That's where it sits, right? So in other words, that it was a book about a farewell, but also about time and the distance between the heart and expression.
You're going to read that opening chapter to us now. And of course, what it does is put the reader on alert. It's a 3-page chapter. And you're on alert that there is going to be complexity and perhaps regret and difficulty and confusion, emotional confusion. Because we know, again, from your very straightforward title, this is going to be a book about friendship. But it begins, as you say, with a farewell, and quite possibly a permanent farewell. Yeah.
Shall I do that now?
Yes, please.
Okay. I will stand up. I hope you don't take that as a. It's not. I don't mean it to be threatening. It's more out of respect than anything.
Nobody took that as threatening. Now we're all wondering.
No, it's one thing he's going to charge. Okay, and now, lovely interpreters, to whom I am hugely grateful, both as a listener and now as someone on the stage, and thank them enormously for their work. We'll read from the French translation. It is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own, or those we know well, especially those we know best. But as I stand here on the upper level of King's Cross Station, from where I can monitor my old friend Hisham Matar walking across the concourse, I feel I'm seeing right into him, perceiving him more accurately than ever before, as though all along during the 2 decades that we have known one another, our friendship has been a study, and now, ironically, just after we have bid one another farewell, his portrait is finally coming into view. And perhaps this is the natural way of things, that when a friendship comes to an inexplicable end, or wanes, or simply dissolves into nothing, the change we experience at that moment seems inevitable, a destiny that was all along approaching, like someone walking towards us from a great distance, recognizable only when it is too late to turn away. No one has ever been a nearer neighbor to my heart. I'm convinced, as I watch him go to his train for Paris, that city where the 2 of us first met so long ago and in the most unlikely way, that he is carrying, right where the rib cages meet, an invisible burden, one, I believe, I can perceive from this distance. When he still lived here in London, hardly a week would pass without us taking a walk either through the park or along the river. We sometimes got into a debate, usually concerning an obscure literary question, arguments that, perhaps like all arguments, concealed deeper disagreements. I would sometimes, to my regret, for the gesture has always displeased me, tap my forefinger on his chest and let my palm rest there for a fleeting moment, as though to keep whatever it was that I believed I had placed there stable. And I would once again take note of the distinct pattern of his ribs, the strange way his bones protruded, as if in constant expectation of an attack. He does not know that I'm still here. He thinks I have left, rushed off to the dinner engagement I told him I was already late for. I'm not sure why I lied. "Who are you eating with?" he asked. "No one you know," I replied. He looked at me then, as if we had already parted ways and the present was the past, I standing at the shore and he on board the ship sailing into the future. That burden in the chest, I can see, has rolled his shoulders back a little, causing his hips to fall forward so as to compensate and stop him falling at the slightest push, face first. And yet, he does look from this distance like a man possessed by action, moving forward, determined to enter his life. These past years since 2011, since the Libyan revolution and all that followed it, the countless failures and missed opportunities, the kidnappings and assassinations, the civil war, entire neighborhoods flattened, the rule of militias changed Hisham. Evidence of this was in his posture, but also in his features, the soft tremble in the hands, perceptible each time he brought a cigarette to his mouth, the doubt around the eyes, the cautious climate in them, a face like a landscape liable to bad weather. Soon after the start of the revolution, he returned home and, perhaps naturally, a distance opened between us. On the rare occasions he visited London, we were easy in one another's company, but less full-hearted somehow. I'm sure he too noticed the shift. Sometimes he stayed with me, sleeping on the sofa in my studio flat, staying with me, sleeping on the sofa in my studio flat, sharing the same room where we could speak in the dark till one of us fell asleep. Most of the time, though, he got a room at a small hotel in Paddington. We would meet there in the neighborhood arranged around the train station, which fills the surrounding streets with a transitory air, made us both feel like visitors and accentuated the sense that our friendship had become a replica of what it had once been when he lived here and we shared the city the way honest laborers share tools. But now, when he spoke, he often looked away, giving the impression that he was thinking aloud or involved in a conversation with himself. And when I was telling him a story, I would notice myself leaning forward slightly and catch an almost querulous tone in my voice, as though I were trying to convince him of an unlikely proposition. No one is more capable of falsities, nor as requiring of them, than those who wish never to part ways.
Thank you so much. My goodness. Listening to you read that and thinking too of the sort of ambulatory background of the book, and how important, therefore, rhythm is to it.
Yeah.
And thinking of what you just said about the clues that you found in those first ideas for the book. There's so many clues in that first chapter for us. We realize it's going to be about places that are transitory and also places where people try to put down roots.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about first the nature of this friendship before we talk about the other person in this triangle of friends. An interesting thing to note is that Khaled, our narrator, first encounters Hossam not in person.
No, on the page.
In a totally different way.
Yeah, he first hears a story. Hossam is a writer, and he hears a story written by Hossam, read on the radio, on the BBC Arabic World Service, when Khalid, the narrator, is still 14, living at home with his family, and they listen to the story together. And it's a very peculiar story. It's a story about a man who is eaten by his cat, and the cat comes all the way, eats the man up, and comes all the way to the head, and the man says, "No," and the cat leaves. So it's obviously a political allegory, very similar to those short stories that were written at the time. I remember as a kid myself, that were trying to say something about the politics without being accused of saying something about the politics. But this story infects Khalid. It infects his imagination. He was already a big reader by then, but this story really gets to him. And then later happens to become friends. 10 years later happens to become friends with the author.
By which time, of course, so much has
changed.
Yes,
a lot has changed.
He's now a young man.
Yeah.
He has come to London. He's come to Scotland, in fact.
Yeah.
First, he goes to be a student in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
He comes to London and thereby, suddenly, in an unplanned and traumatic way, becomes
embroiled and all that. Yeah.
An embroiled person,
Yeah.
a suspect,
Yeah.
somebody who has to live almost underground.
Yeah.
And somebody who almost has no identity, has to depersonalize.
That's right. Yeah. There's so Khalid, 4 years after this, he has this incredible stroke of luck where he wins a scholarship to University of Edinburgh to study literature there. These were government-sponsored scholarships. And so he goes to one of these, and there he befriends the third friend in the triangle, Mustafa, who's also a student of literature. There was a joke back then that these government scholarships contained two kinds of people, readers and writers, right? People, in other words, who went to study, who were really genuinely interested in studying, the readers, and people who went to write reports about everybody else, right? But the happy majority went to do neither of those things. Most people went to these scholarships to have fun, to spend a couple of years abroad, not interested in reading or writing. And my two friends, Mustafa and Khalid, are readers. And they go to London because in April 1984, is a very, and some of you might remember this, but there was a very important event. A demonstration takes place in front of the then Libyan embassy on St. James's Square. Demonstrators, Libyan students, flock to London from all around the British Isles to demonstrate the attack on their colleagues back home, students that had been arrested, rounded up, tortured. A couple of them were killed. And so the students abroad think, well, we owe it to them to go and demonstrate. And because they're worried about their identities, they all wear masks and balaclavas and so on. And from the first floor window of the embassy staff fire on the demonstration. This is not me making this up. This is a real event. And they shoot 11 demonstrators, Libyan demonstrators, and they kill WPC Yvonne Fletcher, a young policewoman working that day. And that event, really stunned me. I was much younger, my protagonist. I was 13 when it happened, 5 years younger than Khalid. But Khalid and Mustafa were 18. They go to this demonstration. They're wounded. Their whole life changes. They can't go back to Edinburgh because they're worried about being spotted by the writers. and they can't go back home because for the same reason. And so they remain in London, and really all of their expectations of what life would be like, all of their plans are upended, and they're really having to improvise like a lot of exiles and immigrants have to do. You have to sort of translate yourself into the place, and you have to translate the place back, to yourself, and not only language but mannerisms, and to learn how to live away from the people that are closest to you. And they become, the three friends become their co-conspirators, as it were. They improvise a life together and against one another. It depends at certain moments.
They improvise their lives in completely different ways, don't they?
Yeah.
And this is, of course, how temperament, time, chance, they all intersect.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk to you about this idea of exile and friendship and character.
Yeah.
Because Khaled, is changed utterly in that moment.
Yeah.
And reacts in a way that allows him to become the narrator of this story.
Yeah.
He is a man who looks to see what is happening.
Yeah.
He reads, he becomes a reader, he stays a reader.
Yeah.
He reads situations and people all the time. It's a form of action, but it's not the kind of action that others take.
No, his friends, you're right. His friends turn into men of action. Mustafa, from Khalid's point of view, goes into the past, returns home, and they both, Khalid and Hisham, return home. But then Hisham, at this moment, he's getting on a train to Paris from where he's going to San Francisco. It feels like a final parting. And so from Khalid's point of view, he's moving into the unknown future. But Khalid sort of commits to the present in ways that I found very, really moved me, They really moved me because his present is really spare and rudimentary and stark. But he wants to stay with the particulars, He wants to remain with the particulars. And we catch him at this moment where he's trying to think, really. He's trying to survey what he's ended up with now that his friends are gone. And friendship is fascinating because, of course, one of the many things that friendship is a love affair, and it's unlike any other love affair, because siblings, parents, and children are also involved in a sort of love affair. But that familial love affair is got so much protocol around it. We know how blood ties oblige us, right? With all of the various different ways that we have, as human beings, of organized family structures, there's some common ground about how blood ties oblige us. We know, for example, that you will most likely end up loving people you might not like, right, in families. In amorous relationships, there's also a protocol. There's vows that are expressed, and, there's at least some assumption. Even people who have very avant-garde amorous structures, there's some, at least, expectation of fidelity in some way, or a resistance against it, one or the other. But it's the elephant in the room, right? Whereas with friendship is very promiscuous. You can have many friends. Usually we have many friends at the same time. And we are ourselves promiscuous with the different friends. Different sides of me come out with different friends. Certain conversations that only really are enlivened by that friend and not by the other one, for example. But they're also promiscuous because we know that the best way to ruin a friendship is if you say, this is the kind of friends we're going to be. We're going to be these kind of friends, and we're going to be friends for life. It's the best way to ruin it, right? In other words, friendship thrives on being a work in progress, being an experiment. And these three friends are trying to balance that sort of required freedom of what the best sort of friendships are, whilst being in a space that is very restricted, which is exile. Not being able to go, not being able to really thrive, so.
And always waiting for something to happen. This is one thing that they do, isn't it? They think that something will happen in the country from which they've been exiled. And indeed, it does, not always in the way that they expect it to. One of the things that's a wonderful kind of space you use in the novel is the cafe at which they all meet. And we see them in all sorts of places doing all sorts of different things. But they show different sides to each other, as you say, in that moment when they all meet, occasionally in the company of women too. But there is this sense, as you said, that they are co-conspirators. Do you think they could have had a friendship that was at all recognisable as the one they do have, had they not been in exile? How important is this other space to their friendship?
That's a good question. It's hard for me to know that. It's very interesting how my knowledge really stops at the borders of the book. It's very, you know? Like, I don't really know. Like, someone was asking me, why does he never go home? You know, he doesn't go home, but we catch him at the moment when he might. I don't know. He might have then later gone home. I have no idea, you know? But all I know is that but I know other things that are within the border but aren't in the book. You know, I wrote other things to just sort of foster my understanding of them. For example, Khalid goes there when he's 18. He has never had sex before. And so I was curious, well, how does Khalid lose his virginity? What are the circumstances? So I thought I needed to write that. And I wrote it, and I thought it worked. I was very convinced by it. You know, I thought that's how he loses his virginity. It makes perfect sense to me. But it didn't fit in the book. It just didn't seem to be, you know. So
it didn't go in.
Didn't go in.
I'm so glad you say that, because as you were just describing that, I was thinking, I just don't remember that bit.
No.
But that's because it didn't go. I thought, did I not read that attentively?
Yeah. But
you had to know it.
But it deepened my understanding of him. Similarly with Hisham. With Hisham and Khalid, you see, Khalid is desirous. Hisham is a writer who stopped writing, which is a very complicated position. He stopped writing, doesn't want to write anymore. He gets visited by ideas, and he sends them away. You know, he doesn't want to write. And Khalid is you know, hopeful all the time that he might convince his friend to, you know, whose writings he loves, to commit to his vocation. But I also I wondered that conversation, how does that exist next to what Hisham is really thinking about in his solitude? Because as we know, the conversations we have with our friends, you know, they may be honest and as honest as we want them to be, but they're not the same conversations that we have with ourselves, of course. And so I wanted to know what that's like. So it turned out I discovered that Hisham was actually trying to write. And he was trying to write certain pieces which I wanted to know what they would be and what was the problem with them. Why weren't they working? So I needed to write stories that failed, you know, on behalf of Hisham, for me to understand more about...
Did you literally do that?
I did. They're not in the book.
That task.
They're not in the book. But you see, what that does is it gives me the thing that I most want, which is, paradoxically, people speak about the sound of a character. What I'm really interested in is the silence of the character. I want to know what it would be like sitting next to him. You know, what it would be like, you know, sitting next to him at night driving. Neither of us are talking. I want to know what that's like. And so these things, these other sort of extra literary writings are really just there for that purpose. But like I said, those are all within the borders of the book. They might be working, you know, on other levels, but they're within the borders of the book.
I mean, within the borders of the book, and also suggested, but not explicit, are so many untold stories.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're explicit in the sense of one of the things that I found incredibly moving, I mean, distressing, was the way in which Khaled, who loves his family, has to make up a completely different life to tell them about while he's separated from them because of censorship, because of surveillance.
Yeah, he used to protect them. Yeah.
He estranges himself
Yeah.
from them without wishing to in any way, and it is heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's you know, a lot of these calls are monitored. I mean, I remember, I'm not, thankfully, wasn't in that situation, but I had, not my immediate family, but my cousins and aunts and so on. During those years in Libya, when I would call them, I could hear somebody picking up the phone and listening to us. You know? And it changes what you say. You know,
and your relationship,
and in a way, your relationship. You know, letters come opened, your letters arrive to them opened, and so you are being witnessed. You know, and that sort of stuff really works. Sadly, you know, it does, and also it engages you into thinking, well, why are they doing that? I mean, I'm just calling my cousin. Why? I'm not some politically active person, or, you know, why do that? And I think one of the reasons to do that is exactly because to complicate that intimacy. Because I think power is very anxious about that intimacy. Power, in other words, is very envious. It's very jealous. It's like a mad, jealous lover, you know, that wants to monitor everything, you know. And they are touched by that. And so you're right, Khalid is fearful that his parents know why he has not returned home, because he doesn't want to break their heart. He doesn't want them to know that he's been wounded. So he makes up stories that he's doing this PhD and he's now become a translator and et cetera, et cetera. But something happens, because I think also because they're such a close family, they know when he's lying, they know he's lying. And it alters the heart, that even though you have, you know, you could explain it to yourself, it really, you know, if you've ever been very close to somebody that you know is not telling you the truth, even for a good reason, it changes, it complicates your intimacy. And it sheds, I think, a very interesting light on the nature of intimacy, you know.
It's a kind of, in a way, a form of corruption, isn't it? That gets corrupted, in a sense. And for a book that is so much about friendship, one of the other things that we encounter in Halle is this need for solitude, this need to put up barriers of kinds. He is wary of change. He finds his place that he lives in London, which is not great, but it's a space that
he never moves.
And he never moves.
Yeah, never moves.
And you feel constantly in this book, and another reason that it is so moving, profoundly moving, is that you feel so many doors have just been shut to him.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, isn't that what life is? Doors shutting and a path taken.
Yeah.
But he's a very compromised individual.
He is. Yet, I couldn't quite make up my mind whether he was a portrait of somebody who was brave or the opposite. Because there seemed to me something incredibly brave about somebody who is committing to the present, you know, to put it that way. And also that possessive my friends felt to me, the more I was working on the book, the more it seemed that it referred to the books, because he's somebody who is very much accompanied by books. He's a very close reader. He carries lines in his pockets, and you know, metaphorically speaking. And these writers have really helped him navigate his life in this place. So he has a very curious relationship to London, because it's a London that is, you know, he doesn't, he's very agile with it, you know, and we catch him at this moment when he's walking across, and he's taking tangents. He's going not a direct line home. Yet he never does that thing that all of us now do, even people who have lived in the same place forever, is take out their phone and check which way is, you know, he never does that. He's, in other words, incredibly fluent with the city. He knows exactly what to make of, what to do with it, where to go. Yet he's trapped in what you're describing. He's trapped in this moment of really being left behind, you know. His friends have gone. He's not really sure what the future looks like. And that contradiction I found so fascinating. And the parallels it began to draw between he's really somebody who's not only enthused by close reading, but he has put his faith into it. So close reading of books, close reading of people, of the city, as though that's how you find your home.
The part of the book that deals with the writers that he reads and the bonds that he forms with the books that he loves is really powerful, because it's not just a way of describing what kind of mind he has. It sort of describes his relationships of feeling with those books.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found particularly interesting, of course, was the writers who you talked about, people like Robert Louis Stevenson, for example. So you immediately think, okay, Jekyll and Hyde. He's not a Jekyll and Hyde figure, but he is a figure who is in some ways conflicted, and so are other characters in the books. But you also talk about the way in which he unites the classics of English and European literature that he reads with the books of Arabic literature that he has grown up with, that his father loves, and how he comes to see them as this great this united body of work that we all have access to, and I was so interested by that. Yeah,
I mean, that is, if I'm to be, to speak on that sort of less interesting level, that is the most autobiographical detail in the book, in the sense that part of me is outraged, actually, if I'm to be honest. Part of me is outraged by these distinctions. I can see why they're important in the academy, in the library, but in a lived life, they seem totally ridiculous to me, why we are engaging with this incredible inheritance. I mean, it's just a profound inheritance, I mean, and all the languages and all of the genres in it. So I'm quietly unsettled by the fact that somebody like Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri doesn't mean anything here or in Britain. Friends of mine, great readers, adventurous readers, have no idea who Ahmed Faris al-Shidiyaq is, or all of these fabulous writers. This is not to say that I am some kind of bibliophile. I'm also filled with holes and ignorances. We all are. But for them to be so much organized around cultural lines, I think, is really dangerous and narrowing. And so he is someone where all of these people, for him, Joseph Conrad, and Ahmed Faris al-Shidiyaq or Tayyib Saleh are part of the same river. They're part of the same sort of history, which it seems to me is the case, right? So.
It's also very telling, isn't it, the writers that one does cleave to at various points, because of course you do write about Conrad and his relationship with Conrad. And, well, who is Conrad? Someone who came and reinvented himself and expressed himself in an entirely different language, as did Nabokov, for example, as have a handful of writers. Now, that sort of suggests having to have a kind of doubleness in your life.
I think that's actually, if I'm to be honest, that's sort of the flip side of the passion you heard in my voice when I talked about this. Because I think what I said is true, but it's not the whole truth. Because the other side of it is that somebody like me has a kind of quiet despair all the time about being divided between languages, about the fact that today I went into your wonderful library and I found this whole shelf of one of my favorite poets, Adonis, in Arabic. And I started reading it. I am educated in the English language. I write in the English language. I think in the English language. But Arabic is also my first love affair, And so, and that's just, it's the way it is. There's no resolution there. There's just this polyphony of notes or melodies that are sometimes in harmony and sometimes are not, And anyway, and then I read this line in one of his books. And then I went and sat with the wonderful Hannah, who we're going to hear next. The line in Adonis is, this is my very rough translation, but the wind is nature's dialect. Light is its classical tongue. right? So, and as we were sitting there having our cup of tea, the wind blew and the tent started pushing against my back, you know? So these moments, these sort of, I don't know how to describe them, but they really feel like moments on a fault line of something, you know, for me. So I think my passionate advocacy and encouragement for everybody in this room to go and read Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri and Ahmed Faris al-Shidyaq is really, to be honest, not only my encouragement for us all to read more widely, but it's also my personal, completely ridiculous aspiration that the fault line is somehow mended, you know, between the two languages.
This is probably an impossible question for you to answer. If there weren't that fault line between languages, between cultures, between countries, if you hadn't lived these different parts of life, what would you write? Would you write?
I don't know.
Would you be the same writer? I'm not just talking about subject material.
Yeah, I don't know. But yesterday, you know, I don't know why this comes to mind now. Whether it's connected to, but when I hear you ask that, I think yesterday when you and I were sitting here, listening to that wonderful event yesterday about love, and you know what it might be, what is it, what could it be, etc. I was thinking at that moment, I was thinking of those opening pages of Ovid's Metamorphoses, because Ovid talks about the world being in a state of chaos. But the chaos that Ovid is talking about is not the way that we now use the word chaos, which is, you know, a jumble of things. And, you know, my day went chaotically wrong, meaning it all fell apart and so on. But in Ovid's language, the word chaos didn't mean that. The word chaos meant a state of indifference, right? Which is also why when you love someone and they don't love you back, the world feels chaotic, right? It's also that sort of, so I think he puts his finger on something very interesting about chaos and indifference. And then how is that indifference resolved in Ovid's Metamorphoses is that the distinctions between things is defined. You know, the line between the land and the sea, between the sky and the sea, the distinctions are settled. Nature has somehow stopped being indistinct, right? And so, in other words, I think the little philosophy that is contained there in Ovid's Metamorphoses is that harmony, love, meaning, in other words, is found in the relationships, in contact. That's where meaning is found. Right?
At the places where these things
where things meet, that's where meaning is, right? And yesterday, as I was listening to the talk about love, I was thinking that would be one possible definition for it for me, that love is meaning, is the contact where meaning is found, and which is why also in states of love that don't go well, they feel incredibly chaotic and meaningless, because they promise the meaning, but it isn't there for whatever reason.
The ground is going.
The ground, exactly.
It's unanchoring.
Yeah, and I think the reason maybe, now I'm sort of reading into my answer, the reason maybe why I thought of that when you asked me, the question that you asked me, is that one of the things that I've always found infinitely interesting about somebody like Joseph Conrad is that he is really enlivened by meaning. He really is one of those writers that can really put his finger on a thing. You know, he can really illuminate something. At the same time, he does that thing that I think H.G. Wells talks about that with Conrad. They were friends. And he would say that he's a brilliant writer, but sometimes he would go into a fog, and you don't know what he's talking about. And then he would come back again. And it's true that in Joseph Conrad, there are moments when the whole project of meaning collapses, you know, which is also partly what's fascinating about him on the page.
Hisham, I really want to bring the audience in. I have one last question to ask you, which again is an enormous question that we could spend another hour talking about, I think, but we won't. You've written about such deeply personal, I mean, things that happen so deeply within the person. You've written also about big events, traumatic events you do in this novel. There are big scenes where stuff really happens.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, there is conflict, there is war, there is violence, there is also introspection. Throughout all this, you have a style of writing and a tone that is so incredibly in itself moving and impressive. It's so controlled and so gentle, and I always, the word gentle always comes to mind. And I wonder why and how and what it means to you to write like that.
Oh, that's, yeah. I don't know, but I hope, I mean, coming from you, that means the world to me. I hope that's true. And if it is true, it's maybe because I think that I'm very interested in questions of attention. You know, I really think that the attention we give to things changes those things. You know, how we listen, how we look, how we attend alters the world. You know, I really think that. And I also think there's a relationship between attention and justice. I think that if you're really interested in causing harm to someone, you don't pay them any attention. It is not for nothing, for example, that in Israel right now there's no coverage of what's happening in Gaza. You know, most people in Israel have not seen the images that we've seen unless they deliberately go and search for them. You know, so there is a relationship between how we pay attention to something and the consequences. You know, so this is something that's always concerned me, and having members of my family, my father, of course, most importantly, who was a political prisoner who vanished in the prison system, who had been tortured, and these questions have always been close to me. You know, what do you need to do in order to torture somebody? What are the things that would facilitate that? And in other words, what are the things that would complicate it? You know, and also my own strange feeling of obligation that I need to pay attention to the torture. That I need, so I have a very peculiar interest in, and if I am can put it this way, a kind of tenderness towards the son of the man who tortured my father. I don't know who he is, of course, but I think that's very different. That's a very complicated, you know. So these questions have always been with me in some way. So I think that the more something is truly unbearable, the more we need to approach it with what I would call a kind of fierce tenderness. You know, where you are able to bear it. If you could bear it, it somehow begins to become elaborate in an interesting way. You know, yeah. So this is something that maybe it's a myth. If it's a myth, I'm happy to function under it. You know, but it's my myth, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you. That was such an illuminating answer. Thank you so much. I must take some questions from the audience as we nearly run out of time. Who would like to ask a question? Did I see a hand at the back, or have I? My eyesight is not at its best. As we've been talking about aging, haven't we?
Yeah, I do actually.
A gentleman in the front row here, just in the very front row. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Half of it took me to sleep.
I could see that.
Yes, but
sitting in the front row,
some of it
asleep.
took me out of these deep dreams, and one of those was that love is mostly into relationships between two. Do you have a special perspective about what is loving oneself, or self-love, being something that is not reachable by you?
mean, you know, I'm not. Not sure about that. Not sure. I'm not sure I also understand fully, but
we talked, didn't we, a little about this regard that one has for oneself, the tenderness that one may show oneself, which I think is again something that you address. And actually, in the novel, there are moments when characters can't show themselves compassion and tenderness. And they seem very important to you too.
No.
Would anyone else like to ask a question? Yes.
Hi. I wanted to go back to your observation about the division of information, and I was really curious. Do you feel any responsibility or burden even for sharing the recent history of Libya with your readers? Because for myself, it's pretty much through your books that's kind of recent news that's all I know about it. Or does it not seem like that when you're writing?
Yeah.
Thank
No,
you.
that's a good question. To be honest, I don't feel a burden. It doesn't come from a place of obligation. I write a bit like a reader in a sense, like really, I really write the first page or a paragraph or a sentence, and I think, what would the next one be like? It's a bit like that. Deeper into the book, those questions become, bigger. Like with this one, for example, I realized halfway through that this book was about friendship in the ways that we've been talking, but also about friendship metaphysically, that the book itself thought of itself as having a friendship with the reader. So it starts a bit formal, these long sentences, and then it speeds up, the sentences get shorter. Very intimate information is shared in the second half that Khalid would feel uncomfortable sharing in the first half, So I write a bit like that, like a reader, really. But I'm not really, having at least a conscious sort of desire to have a particular effect on you. Of course, it delights me that you felt closer to a place that means a lot to me, or if you've learned something about it, that's great. But it's not, if I'm to be honest, it's not really my objective. What I would like, maybe what the objective, there's an objective or there's a hope, is to reciprocate the pleasure that I get as a reader. I've gotten all my life as a reader, where I've never felt, more Russian than when I'm reading a Russian novel. That I've never felt more like a woman than in books. I've never felt more like what it might be like to be somebody, very different from me politically or whatever. So that is something that I feel is really a very important part of any project that is to do with that wants to attend to our spirits and to our minds. So I would like to think that I'm trying to participate in this endeavor, but not consciously. Yeah.
But I agree. I had the similar thing. You were finding things out and seeing things in a different way. Hisham, we're kind of basically out of time. We're going to get into trouble if we go on.
Yeah.
I'm just going to very briefly remember something that happened last night when, Hisham, you and I'd like to say...
Oh, dear.
Well, it's nothing like that.
Oh, it's nothing like that. Okay.
Nothing like... I'm not going to say that we were drunk or anything.
No, we were...
With other writers and all, nothing.
No, we don't want to corrupt people here. We don't.
Nothing like that. Although I am going to reveal bad behaviour on my part, because we went outside just to have a last little look at the lake.
Yeah,
it was such a beautiful, beautiful evening.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
I am disreputable because actually I was having a cigarette and Hisham is very gallant and was accompanying me. And just as we stood looking at the beautiful lake, do you remember those teenage boys ran across, and at first we were like, what is happening? Is it kind of a fight? And jumped into the lake and swam.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And I kind of felt I mean, we were middle-aged. We were a bit like, oh my God, it must be freezing.
Yeah.
Do they even have towels?
Yeah.
We were worried about their health.
Yeah.
But could there have been anything more emblematic for us talking and this conference? They were just friends in the most
wonderful.
amazing moment. And it felt like they'd been sent to illustrate ours. But I suppose this is narcissism.
Yes, what a lovely way of putting it.
Do you
Yeah,
think?
it's lovely. I love it. Yeah, I love that.
Hisham, reading this book is an immensely profound experience. I can't imagine what it took to write it. We're so grateful that you came to speak about it.
Thank you so much,
This wonderful
Alex.
conference.
Thank you.
We're going to go and sign copies. We must get out of the way so the next session may begin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you.